Welcome to the deep dive. I am your host. And today we are getting into something that, well, I think it challenges a lot of the assumptions we just casually walk around with.
Oh, absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm the resident expert here,
Yeah.
and I am really excited about this one. It's a topic that has so much historical baggage attached to it.
Yeah, totally. Because, when you step into almost any grand historical cathedral today, whether it's Notre Dame or Westminster Abbey or just like a beautiful old church in your hometown, you are immediately confronted by these massive, towering figures immortalized in stained
All
glass.
right, the classic imagery.
Exactly. The sun hits that cobalt blue and ruby red glass, and you see these men draped in these pristine, flowing robes. They've got halos glowing around their heads, their hands are raised in perpetual blessing, and they always have these perfectly calm, serene, completely untroubled expressions on their faces.
Like they've never had a bad day in their lives.
Right. They look untouchable. They look like they have never made a single mistake, never lost their temper, never doubted a single thing in their entire lives. And because of centuries of that specific artistic branding, we have developed this collective, almost subconscious expectation of who the 12 disciples of Jesus actually were.
We really have.
Hmm.
We think of them as these polished, flawless saints who just, floated 3 inches above the dirt of the first century.
Yeah, just glowing with holy purpose from day one. But the reality is so different.
It is a very sanitized view.
Hmm.
It is almost a retroactive mythology, if you think about it.
Hmm.
We have taken the massive, highly structured global institution that exists today, and we've basically projected its polished image backward onto its founders.
Which makes sense from a PR standpoint, I guess.
Well, sure. But we look at them through the lens of a 2,000-year-old victory, rather than looking at them in the exact moment they were living in, which was, frankly, infinitely more complicated.
And messy, just so incredibly messy. When you actually peel back the layers of that stained glass mythology, you do not find glowing saints. You find this volatile, first century startup crew that was statistically guaranteed to fail.
Guaranteed, by every metric of the time.
Yeah, you step into the gritty, muddy, deeply flawed reality of the Middle East in late antiquity, and that pristine image just shatters into a million pieces. And that is exactly what we are doing on today's deep dive.
Ripping up the polished portraits.
Exactly. We've got a fascinating set of research on the table today. We are heavily drawing from a comprehensive paper titled The Life and Ministry of the 12 Disciples of Jesus by Chris R. Velazquez.
It is an excellent, incredibly detailed source.
It really is. And we are cross-referencing that with the historical bedrock of the Encyclopedia Britannica to keep us grounded. We are going to look at who these dozen seemingly random, remarkably unqualified guys actually were in their original context.
Which I would argue is the only way to truly understand the phenomena of what actually happened. Because to understand the what's of the disciples' lives, what they did, how they functioned, and why their movement survived, we first have to thoroughly understand the why of their world.
Right, the environment that made them.
Exactly. We have to understand the specific pressure cooker that forged them. Because this was not some fairy tale realm. It was a world defined by intense political friction, brutal military occupation, and honestly, an almost suffocating level of apocalyptic religious expectation.
The best way I can think to describe what we are looking at in this research is to think of the disciples like a famous band before they got big.
Oh, I like that analogy.
You know what I mean?
Oh.
Before the massive stadium tours, before the platinum records, before the carefully curated PR teams. In these historical texts, we're seeing them playing dive bars.
Right. They are hauling their own gear in a beat-up van.
Yeah. Exactly. We are seeing them messing up the chords, getting into petty arguments backstage about who the lead singer is, and just looking completely unpolished. We are looking at the raw, volatile startup phase of a movement.
And if we want to understand how that startup survived its own incompetence, we really have to start with the dirt they were walking on.
So let's ground the listener in the history. What exactly is the political tinderbox of this specific era? Because, we always hear about King Herod, but the timeline gets a little blurry for me when we actually get to the calling of these 12 guys.
That is a really common point of confusion.
Yeah.
The timeline is absolutely crucial for understanding the tension they were living under. So the overarching shadow over this entire region, historically speaking, is Herod the Great.
Okay, Herod the Great.
Right. He was a Roman-appointed client king, meaning he basically answered to Rome, but he ruled locally. And he was in power from roughly 37 to 4 BCE.
So before Jesus was even born, mostly.
Exactly. He was the architect of this massive, brutal political apparatus that kept the region firmly under the thumb of the Roman Empire, while still technically having a king of the Jews on the throne.
It's like a puppet regime.
Total puppet regime. He was known for these monumental building projects, like the massive expansion of the Second Temple, but also for his intense paranoia and extreme violence.
Right, but he is dead by the time these fishermen are actually being called off their boats, right?
Yes, exactly. After Herod the Great's death around 4 BCE, his vast realm wasn't just handed over to one single successor. It was fractured.
Typical Roman strategy.
Right, divide and conquer. It was divided among his sons by the Roman Emperor Augustus. So during the actual time of Jesus' ministry and the formation of this core group, which historians generally place around 27 to 30 CE, you do not have one unified kingdom.
You have a fractured map.
You have a divided, highly anxious political landscape. Up in the north, in the regions of Galilee and Perea, you have Herod Antipas ruling as a tetrarch. He's there from 4 BCE all the way to 39 CE.
Okay, so he's a local ruler, but still a puppet of Rome.
Exactly. And then down south.
Yeah, what is happening down in Jerusalem?
Down south in Judea, which includes Jerusalem, things had gone so poorly with the local rulers that Rome eventually just said forget it and took direct control.
Oh, wow. They just stepped in.
Yeah. By the time of this narrative, from roughly 26 to 36 CE, you have Pontius Pilate serving as the Roman prefect, so you have this patchwork of administration. You've got indirect Roman rule in the north under Antipas, and direct Roman military governance in the south under Pilate.
And Rome's strategy for ruling this area wasn't just pure, unadulterated oppression every single second of the day, right? I mean, they had a system to keep things manageable.
Rome was highly, highly pragmatic. Their primary goals were always the extraction of taxes and the maintenance of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace.
Right. Don't mess with the money and don't start a riot.
That's the golden rule of the Roman Empire. So they generally allowed conquered peoples, including the Jewish population, to retain their ancient customs.
Which was actually pretty rare for an empire to do, wasn't it?
It was a massive concession. They allowed Sabbath observance, they allowed the temple sacrifices to continue, and they actually exempted Jews from having to offer sacrifices to the Roman emperor.
Oh, because that would violate the whole monotheism thing.
Exactly. Rome knew that pushing too hard on religious suppression in Judea would just ignite endless, costly revolts. It wasn't worth the troops.
But, I mean, that tolerance was purely surface level, right?
Completely surface level. Beneath that veneer of bureaucratic tolerance, the resentment of the Roman occupation was a daily, visceral reality.
It had to be exhausting.
You have to imagine what it feels like to live in a covenantal land that you deeply believe was promised to your ancestors by God, only to have to pay exorbitant taxes to a foreign pagan emperor just to survive.
Yeah, to literally fund your own oppressors.
And to see Roman soldiers patrolling your streets knowing they had the legal authority to force you to carry their gear, or worse, to execute you via crucifixion.
Which is such a horrific way to die.
It was specifically designed as a state-sponsored terrorist tactic to publicly humiliate and deter rebels. It was meant to send a message. So this wasn't just a distant political disagreement discussed in, like, high society. It was an everyday humiliation.
And because of that, you've got these intense nationalist and militant groups constantly brewing under the surface, just waiting for a spark.
Exactly. It is a total powder keg.
But what blows my mind when reading through this research is that the geographic center of this entire startup movement wasn't Jerusalem.
No, it wasn't.
If you're going to start a massive religious or political movement in this era, you would think you go to the capital city, right? You go to where the temple is, where the wealth is, where the religious elites are stationed.
That would be the logical business plan.
Right, but that is not what happens. The entire operation is based out of Galilee, way up in the north.
And that geographical distinction changes how we view absolutely everything about these men. Galilee was not the polished elite religious center.
It was the sticks.
It was rural, it was deeply agricultural, and specifically around the Sea of Galilee, it was driven by a robust working-class fishing economy.
So they are blue-collar workers.
Very much so. The people here were viewed by the elites down in Jerusalem as somewhat provincial. They thought they were maybe a little unrefined in their dialect and maybe a bit lax in their strict observance of certain rabbinic traditions.
We were the country cousins.
Precisely. And this is the world the majority of the disciples were pulled from. They weren't scholars debating fine points of law in the temple courts. They were men who worked with their hands for a living.
Let's look at Capernaum for a second, because the historical texts identify it as the major base of operations for this entire movement,
Yeah, Capernaum is fascinating. It was a bustling fishing village, but it was also a border town.
which means it had a toll booth.
Exactly, a toll booth and a Roman garrison. And the archaeology in Capernaum is just staggering.
The sources mention a synagogue, right?
Yes. Excavators have found the remains of this beautiful, white, limestone synagogue, dating from the late 4th, early 5th century CE. But beneath it, literally in the foundational bedrock, they found the remains of an earlier 1st century synagogue,
Wow.
built of local black basalt stone.
So you can literally go there today and stand on the exact stones, the actual foundation where these historical narratives took place. That is wild to me.
It really bridges the gap between text and reality.
It really does. It takes it out of the realm of abstract theology and drops it right into the dirt. And the research highlights several other archaeological anchors that do this same thing, right? Like the Pilate stone.
Oh, the Pilate inscription is a monumental piece of evidence. For a long time, skeptics actually argued that Pontius Pilate might have been a later literary invention.
Wait, really? People thought he was made up.
Yeah, because outside of the New Testament and a few disputed historical references, there just wasn't much physical evidence of him ruling Judea.
That's crazy considering how famous he is now.
But then, in 1961, archaeologists were excavating the coastal city of Caesarea Maritima, which was basically the Roman headquarters in the region.
Okay.
And they found a piece of limestone that had been repurposed as a step in a later theater.
They were just walking on it.
Yes. And on it, there was a Latin inscription dedicating a temple to the Emperor Tiberius, commissioned by, and I quote, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea.
They literally used a monument to the Roman governor as a staircase a few centuries later. That is incredible.
That perfectly corroborates his official title and his presence in the exact time frame the historical narratives describe.
And the sources also bring up the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes, found in the caves of Qumran. They give us this massive, unprecedented look at the textual stability of the Hebrew Bible, but they also illuminate the intense apocalyptic fever of Second Temple Judaism that we were just talking about.
Right, because the people who wrote them were basically hiding out in the desert, right?
Exactly. You had entire sects of people living out in the wilderness, writing these scrolls, believing that the end of the world was absolutely imminent and that God was about to violently overthrow the Romans.
The tension must have been unbearable. And what was the third one? The Caiaphas ossuary?
Yes, an ossuary is essentially a bone box. In 1990, construction workers in South Jerusalem accidentally broke into a 1st century burial cave.
Just doing road work or something.
Basically, yeah. And inside, they found an incredibly ornate ossuary inscribed with the name of Joseph, son of Caiaphas,
The high priest.
the very family of the high priest who, according to the texts, presided over the trial of Jesus.
I love that you bring all this up and that the research focuses on it because I want to make sure we clarify something for the listener.
Okay, go ahead.
These archaeological finds do not prove the supernatural claims of the texts, right? I mean, finding Pilate's name on a rock doesn't magically prove the resurrection.
Not at all. Archaeology cannot prove theology. It can't prove a miracle happened.
Right.
But what it does do, and what the research heavily emphasizes, is that it definitively anchors the narrative world. It proves that the writers of these texts were not inventing a fantasy realm like Middle-earth.
They weren't just making up a backdrop.
They were describing a highly specific, historically verifiable world. It was a world of complex Roman governance, of wealthy temple aristocracy plotting in Jerusalem, and a deeply text-saturated Jewish culture living in rural Galilean villages. The backdrop is entirely, demonstrably real.
Okay, so if that backdrop is real, it sets up this incredible, almost unbearable tension. And here's where I want to push back on the traditional narrative a bit, where I really want you, the listener, to think about the practicality of what is happening.
Let's hear it.
We have established this is an occupied territory. You've got Roman garrisons on the corners. You've got crippling taxes. You've got apocalyptic groups in the desert waiting for a holy war. If you are starting a movement in that environment, you need absolute unity, right?
You would think so, yeah.
You need your leadership team to be totally aligned, on the same page, zero friction. But according to the roster in these texts, Jesus picks a tax collector,
Yes, Matthew.
a guy who actively works for the Roman apparatus, extracting money from his own people. And then he picks a guy known as a zealot,
Simon.
a guy who likely harbors an intense, militant, burning hatred for Rome and anyone who collaborates with them. Does that not sound like a recipe for an absolute bar brawl?
It sounds like a disaster.
Putting those two guys in the same room isn't a leadership strategy. It sounds like organizational suicide.
From a purely sociological standpoint, it is utterly confounding. Putting those two specific profiles in the same leadership core goes against every known principle of human organization.
So why do it?
To understand why it's so shocking, and to understand the friction you just pointed out, we have to deeply analyze the cultural context of first-century Palestine. We have to look at the sociological fabric of this world,
Okay.
because it was structured around concepts that are somewhat foreign to our highly individualized, modern Western mindset.
Hold on, let's unpack that. When you say sociological fabric, what are we actually talking about? Because, I mean, in our modern world, if I want to change careers, I just update my LinkedIn, put in my 2 weeks notice, and I walk away. It's a completely individual choice.
Right, but that individualism simply did not exist in this culture. We are talking about a world governed by strict kinship ties, the dynamics of honor and shame, rigid purity codes, and perhaps most importantly, patronage systems.
Okay, I need an ELI 5 on patronage, please. Explain it to me like I'm 5. How did that actually work in their day-to-day lives?
Okay, in the ancient Mediterranean world, society was incredibly unequal. There was essentially no middle class.
You were either rich or poor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You were either part of the tiny elite who controlled all the land and wealth, or you were part of the massive peasant class just trying to survive the winter. And because there was no governmental safety net, no unemployment benefits, no social security, the only way to survive if you weren't wealthy was to attach yourself to someone who was.
And that's the patron.
That was the patron-client system. A wealthy patron would offer resources, physical protection, or access to business contracts to a lower-class client.
And nothing comes for free, obviously. What did the client give back?
In exchange, the client owed the patron absolute, unquestioning loyalty. They owed them public honor, which was a huge currency back then, and whatever physical services the patron demanded.
So it's this massive, sticky web of mutual obligation.
It was the glue that held society together. Your family, your kin group, was your primary safety net, and your connections to patrons determined whether you lived or starved. So when the text described Jesus walking along the Sea of Galilee, walking up to these fishermen and saying, "Follow me," and they immediately drop their nets and leave their father in the boat.
Oh, wow. That is not a career pivot.
It is a profound, scandalous rupture. Leaving those nets meant abandoning family obligations in a patriarchal society where honoring your father was a core foundational commandment,
They were basically slapping their families in the face.
and walking away from the local economic engine. They were completely severing their social safety nets.
Let's actually walk through this roster, because if the cost of joining the startup was that high, we need to look at who actually paid it.
Let's do it.
The research provides a really fascinating breakdown of the 12, and what I appreciate is how it contrasts the established historical facts we find in the New Testament texts with the later, highly embellished traditions that cropped up centuries afterward. Let's start with the inner circle. The guys who always seem to be in the room when the big moments happen. Peter, James, and John.
Right, the core three. Peter, or Simon Peter, is undoubtedly the most prominent figure in all the sources. He naturally emerges as the spokesman for the group.
He's always the first one to talk.
Always. He is a Galilean fisherman running what appears to be a decent family business with his brother Andrew. But the narrative arc the texts provide for him is incredibly complex.
He's definitely not a flat character.
He is impulsive. He is the one who confidently, almost aggressively, confesses Jesus as the Messiah. But he's also the one who famously caves under pressure and denies even knowing him.
Only to be restored later.
Exactly. Restored later to become the leading historical witness in the early Jerusalem church.
And then you have James and John, the sons of Zebedee. They are also fishermen, right? Partners with Peter, according to some texts.
Yes, they form this inner triad with Peter. They are nicknamed the Sons of Thunder in Mark's Gospel.
Which is such a cool nickname.
It is, but it hints at a pretty fiery, volatile temperament. They are the ones who asked to call down fire from heaven on a village that rejected them. And again, we have to look at the sociology here. These were manual laborers.
It's such a massive irony to me. When you look at the stained glass windows today, they look so regal and delicate. But historically, these guys worked with their hands. They spent their days hauling heavy, wet nets out of the water.
They smelled like fish and sweat.
Yeah. They were not the educated elite from the Jerusalem seminaries. They didn't have advanced degrees in Torah interpretation, yet they became the primary pillars of this entire movement.
It completely inverts the social hierarchy of the time.
It really does. But as we move down the roster past the fishermen, we hit the scandals. We hit Matthew, also known as Levi.
Matthew is perhaps the most fascinating case study in social friction within the group. The texts identify him as a tax collector from Capernaum.
And to understand the weight of that, we really have to realize what a first-century tax collector actually did. They weren't just boring bureaucrats working for the IRS sitting in a cubicle.
Not at all. They were part of the hated apparatus of indirect Roman client rule under Herod Antipas.
And the system was basically rigged, wasn't it?
The system was essentially privatized. Wealthy individuals would bid on contracts to collect tolls, tariffs, and taxes for a specific region.
Like farming out the tax collection.
Exactly, tax farming. They would pay the governing authority up front, and then they had the military backing to go out and extract that money from the local populace. And here is the catch.
This is the crazy part.
Anything they collected over the contract amount, they kept as personal profit.
Oh, wow. So the entire system is inherently designed for extortion.
Completely.
Mm.
The incentive structure was purely based on greed. And Matthew was likely a toll collector stationed in Capernaum, which was on a major trade route. He was a local Jewish man who had decided to actively collaborate with the occupying empire to squeeze money out of his own neighbors.
To be a tax collector in a tight-knit village society, I mean, you would be a complete social pariah.
You were viewed as a traitor to your nation. You were considered ceremonially unclean because of your constant contact with Gentiles and their currency.
Yeah.
You were socially and morally completely compromised.
So Jesus takes this guy, the ultimate social pariah, the guy who is getting rich off the suffering of his own people, and invites him into the inner circle.
It would have scandalized everyone watching.
But the dynamic gets crazier, because it's not just fisherman and a tax collector. We also have the extremist. We have Simon the Zealot.
Yes, Simon the Cananean, or Simon the Zealot. The original Greek terms used in the text, kananios or zealotes, imply a person of intense, burning political or religious fervor.
Now, wasn't there a specific rebel group called the Zealots?
Well, scholars actually debate whether he belonged to a specific organized militant group, because the formal Zealot party that led the armed rebellion against Rome didn't fully coalesce until a few decades later, around the 60s CE.
Okay, so it might just be a descriptive title.
Right, but the epithet undeniably links him to fierce nationalistic, anti-Roman sentiment. He would have possessed a burning zeal for the purity of the Torah and for Jewish independence.
So he was on the radical edge of the political spectrum.
Exactly. On the spectrum of Jewish resistance, which ranged from passive noncompliance all the way to literal dagger-wielding assassins, Simon was deeply committed to the overthrow of the occupation.
So let's go back to that campfire analogy. You have Matthew, the guy whose entire livelihood, his wealth, his safety, depends on the Roman occupation continuing.
He needs Rome to stay in power.
Right. And across the fire, you have Simon, the guy whose entire identity is defined by a burning desire to violently overthrow the Roman occupation. If I'm Peter, right, a working-class fisherman who is just trying to pay his taxes and keep his head down, I am constantly expecting these two to kill each other.
It is a sociological powder keg, and that alone proves a crucial historical point from the research. This group was not selected for their natural compatibility.
They weren't a culture fit.
They were not a group of friends who just decided to start a club. The friction is baked into the design.
And alongside that powder keg, you have Thomas, the guy who has been branded by history as the ultimate skeptic.
Doubting Thomases, yes. The narrative shows him as a pragmatic, perhaps slightly pessimistic figure. I mean, earlier in the Gospel of John, he basically says, so let's go with Jesus so we can die with him.
A real glass half empty kind of guy.
Very much so. He is the one who point blank refuses to believe the reports of the resurrection from the other disciples, demanding empirical, physical proof. He says he needs to literally touch the wounds.
But the text doesn't really shame him for that, does it?
No, it doesn't. It uses his skepticism to frame a profound transformation, culminating in his confession of Jesus' divinity when he finally sees him.
And then we get to the guys who are honestly just kind of there. They are the background characters of the
The
Gospels.
obscure ones.
Right. The research highlights James, the son of Alphaeus, Jude, who is also called Thaddeus in some lists, and Bartholomew. And the texts note that it is highly debated among scholars as to whether Bartholomew is the same person as Nathanael from John's Gospel.
Yes, that's a long-standing debate.
But these are the obscure figures. They are on the official list, they hold the title, but historically, their profiles are incredibly thin.
They are essentially just names on a roster. The texts tell us almost nothing about their individual personalities, their backgrounds, or what they specifically said or did during this 3-year period.
They just filled out the numbers.
And of course, rounding out the 12, we have the ultimate foil,
Right, Judas.
Judas Iscariot. He is historically certain as the betrayer within the apostolic circle. The texts unblinkingly narrate his betrayal.
The name Iscariot, what does that actually mean?
The exact etymology is still disputed by scholars. Some think it means man of Kerioth, which would be a town in Judea, making him the only non-Galilean in the group.
Oh, that's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, an outsider.
Yeah.
While others think it might relate to the Sicarii, which were the dagger-wielding assassins we mentioned earlier. But regardless of his name's origin, his role in the narrative is glaringly clear.
He is the cautionary tale.
Yeah, is the negative counterexample. He represents the terrifying reality that a person can have absolute proximity to the mission, they can see the miracles firsthand, they can hear the teachings, and yet remain completely unconverted.
Now, here's where the research gets really interesting to me, specifically regarding those obscure background guys we just mentioned, because human nature is funny. We hate a vacuum.
We really do.
We hate empty spaces in a story. When we watch a movie, we want to know what happens to every single character after the credits roll. We want the dramatic sequel for everyone. So in the centuries following the first century, these massive, elaborate traditions popped up around the obscure disciples.
The apocryphal legends.
Yeah. Stories saying Thomas went all the way to India to evangelize or that James traveled to Spain. But the expert consensus in our research today says we need to be incredibly cautious with those legends.
Extremely cautious. The historical confidence in those later geographical traditions is very low.
Why is that? Are they just obvious fakes?
Well, they are often found in apocryphal acts and later church histories that were written generations, sometimes centuries afterward, and they often had an explicit agenda,
Like what?
tying a specific geographic region's church back to a direct apostolic founder. It was a way for a local church to say, hey, we're legitimate, we were founded by Bartholomew.
It was about prestige.
Exactly. The New Testament texts themselves actually leave many of these guys completely obscure. They just fade into the background of the early church in the book of Acts.
And you made a point in your notes that I think is brilliant. You said the fact that they are obscure actually bolsters the historical credibility of the text.
Yes, it's a profound point of literary and historical analysis. Think about it. If these texts were later, pure fabrications designed by a committee to artificially glorify the founders of a new religion,
You'd give them all superpowers.
you would expect epic, detailed, heroic arcs for every single one of the 12. You would invent glorious martyrdoms and incredible adventures for Bartholomew and Thaddeus to make the whole group look amazing.
Right, you wouldn't just leave them as guys who stood in the back and said nothing.
The fact that the texts don't bother to do that they leave them as obscure men known only by a name or a patronymic, argues strongly for the raw, unpolished historical reality of the lists. They are ordinary men swept up in something massive, and the texts don't invent glory for those who simply played a quiet role.
Which is a perfect pivot, because now that we know who they were, this volatile mix of fisherman, a traitor, a zealot, a collaborator, a skeptic, and some guys in the back, we need to look at how they actually function together.
The mechanics of the group.
Right. What was their behavioral arc throughout these texts? How did this ancient incubator actually operate day to day?
To understand their function, we have to look closely at the original language the historical sources used to describe them. There is a very deliberate progression in the Greek terms applied to this group. First, they are primarily referred to as methetes.
Methetes, what does that literally mean?
It literally means a disciple, a learner, or an apprentice. It denotes someone who attaches themselves to a teacher to absorb their entire way of life, not just their academic data.
So it's more like an internship than sitting in a lecture hall.
Much more. But later, specifically after the resurrection and the narrative arc, they become known primarily as apostolos.
An apostle.
Yes, which means one who is sent. It's a delegated envoy or messenger carrying the actual authority of the sender.
So a learner first, an authorized messenger later.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the foundational text the research points to for this transition is Mark chapter 3, verse 14. This is highlighted as the programmatic thesis of their entire existence.
What does it say?
It says Jesus appointed the 12, first that they might be with him, and second that he might send them out to preach.
Oh, that ordering is super important.
It raises an immensely important structural point. In this framework, deep relationship and proximity preceded the mission.
You can't be sent until you've been with him.
Right. They were not just hired hands given a task list and sent into the field. They were formed through intense personal observation and communion over the course of years.
But, and this is honestly my favorite part of the literary realism of the Gospels, that intense private tutoring did not seem to work very well at first.
No, it did not.
You would think that having the ultimate mentor, seeing things nobody else saw, getting all the behind-the-scenes explanations, you would think that would make them absolute spiritual heavyweights right out of the gate.
You'd expect them to be prodigies.
But the research points out this massive recurring cycle of failure. If you are reading the Gospel of Mark, especially chapters 4 through 10, they are not portrayed as heroes at all.
They look incredibly foolish.
They witness incredible miracles, they get the private tutoring, and yet they completely, consistently, almost comically misunderstand what is going on.
The realism is, frankly, shocking for ancient literature. Think about the cultural context we discussed earlier, honor and shame.
Right.
In an honor-based culture, you do not publish the embarrassing failures of your foundational leaders. It brings shame on the entire movement.
The Gospels just put it all out there.
They do not hide their ambition, their petty arguments about who gets the best seats in the kingdom, their paralyzing fear during the storms on the lake, or their utter density when it comes to understanding Jesus' teachings.
The prime example the research highlights for this is Peter in Mark chapter 8.
Oh, yes. That is a pivotal moment.
This is the turning point of the whole book,
Yeah,
right?
it is. Jesus asked them, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter finally gets the right answer. He confidently confesses Jesus as the Messiah, the Christ.
Gold star for Peter.
But then in the very next breath, Jesus begins to explain what that title actually means. That his mission involves suffering, rejection by the elders, and a cross.
And what does Peter do? He pulls Jesus aside and literally rebukes him.
He tells his rabbi he's wrong.
Because Peter's concept of a Messiah, like almost everyone else in that era, was a conquering military hero.
Right, a new David. Someone who would ride into Jerusalem on a war horse, crush the Roman garrisons, kick out Pilate, and restore the geopolitical kingdom of Israel.
A suffering, dying Messiah was an oxymoron to them. It made zero sense.
So Jesus turns around and rebukes Peter publicly, saying, "Get behind me, Satan."
Ouch.
It's a harsh rebuke, but it shows that true confession is entirely meaningless if it fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the mission.
And it doesn't get better from there. It all builds to this incredible climax of failure. During the Passion narrative, the most critical, high-stakes moment of the entire story, they totally fall apart.
Complete systemic collapse.
They go to the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus asks the inner circle to just stay awake and keep watch, and they literally fall asleep on the job. Multiple times.
After being specifically warned.
And when the temple guard finally arrives for the arrest, they completely panic and scatter into the night. Judas actively betrays the leader to the authorities for cash. And Peter, the guy who just days earlier swore he would die for the cause, he denies even knowing Jesus.
3 times.
And he doesn't just deny it to a terrifying Roman centurion with a sword drawn, he denies it to a servant girl by a fire.
It is a total moral failure.
If you think about it in modern terms, it's like they were in an exclusive 3-year startup incubator. They had the ultimate CEO, the ultimate product, the ultimate access. And when it finally came time for the main event, the final pitch to the investors, the moment to prove the concept, they completely bombed it.
They choked.
The CEO is arrested, the board of directors liquidates their shares, they panic, and they flee the country.
That is a highly accurate analogy. The venture completely collapsed under the pressure. By all human metrics of leadership, organizational stability, and historical precedent, the movement was dead on Friday afternoon.
It should have been just another failed messianic movement.
Exactly. The leader was executed as an enemy of the state, and the executive team had proven themselves to be entirely incompetent cowards.
Yet, somehow they get rehired. The company doesn't fold. In fact, a few weeks later, they are suddenly taking over the Roman Empire. How does this narrative arc resolve? Because obviously, Christianity didn't end that night.
The resolution is found in the theological and historical concept of post-resurrection restoration.
Okay, let's look at the texts for that.
The research points heavily to texts like John chapters 20 and 21, and then the opening chapters of the book of Acts. Following the resurrection, the texts depict Jesus deliberately seeking out these failed men.
He doesn't go find new ones.
And this is vital. He doesn't replace them with a new, braver, more competent batch of disciples. He goes back to the cowards. He cooks them breakfast on the beach. He restores them.
And Acts chapter 1 is particularly significant here, right?
Yes, because the very first order of business for the surviving group is restoring their organizational structure. They realize they are down to 11 members because of Judas's defection and suicide, so they hold a process to choose Matthias to replace him.
Right, they have to get the number back up to exactly 12 before they can move forward.
Yes, and that administrative act shows that the catastrophic failure of the cross wasn't the end of their story. Rather, it was a necessary prerequisite for grace-driven rehabilitation.
They had to hit rock bottom.
They had to be entirely stripped of their self-reliance, their arrogance, and their false militaristic ideas of the kingdom. When they were finally empowered by the Spirit later in the narrative of Acts, they transformed from fearful deniers locked in an upper room into bold public witnesses.
Standing before the very council that executed Jesus.
Exactly. But they carry the deep humility of men who know they completely failed and were brought back into the fold only by grace.
But hold on, let's hover on that replacement for a second. Why Matthias? More importantly, why the absolute unbending necessity of the number 12?
It's a great question.
Because the texts make a huge deal out of this. They couldn't just operate with an 11-man board. They couldn't just say, well, Judas is gone, that's a shame, but let's just promote Peter to senior VP, keep the core tight, and move on. Why exactly 12?
Because in this context, the number 12 is not a random staff size. It is not an arbitrary headcount for a committee. In the Jewish mind, steeped in the Hebrew scriptures, the number 12 is massively symbolically charged.
It links to the tribes.
It links directly and unmistakably to the 12 tribes of Israel.
Okay, so this is where we move from the gritty, personal stories of these fishermen and tax collectors into the massive theological symbolism embedded in the text. We are talking about the concept of the new Israel.
Precisely. And to translate what historians and theologians mean when they talk about a redemptive historical bridge, we have to look at the canonical logic across the New Testament.
Break that down for us.
The texts are arguing that God is doing something entirely new, but firmly rooted in the old architecture. In Matthew 19, Jesus specifically tells these disciples that in the renewed world, they will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel.
So they are directly mirroring the patriarchs.
Yes. In Ephesians 2, the Apostle Paul, writing decades later, calls these specific men the very foundation of the church. In Revelation 21, the grand apocalyptic vision of the New Jerusalem descends, and it has 12 foundations, and inscribed on those stones are the names of the 12 apostles.
So they aren't just administrators in the book of Acts. They are walking around as living, breathing metaphors.
Yes. By deliberately choosing exactly 12 men, Jesus was making a profound, unmistakable, and highly provocative claim. He was claiming the authority to reconstitute and renew the people of God around himself.
That is a massive claim.
Just as the Old Covenant people originated from the 12 sons of the patriarch Jacob, the renewed covenant people, the church would originate from these 12 foundational witnesses. They physically embody a restored Israel. They are the bridge between the ancient promises made to Abraham and Moses and the new reality inaugurated by Jesus.
I want you to really ponder this for a second. Let this massive paradox sink in. If these guys are supposed to be this grand, symbolic, new Israel, if they are literally the foundational stones of this new spiritual reality that will eventually encompass billions of people.
Right.
Isn't it incredibly ironic that the people chosen to represent the spiritual high ground are exactly the ones repeatedly failing to understand the mission?
It is the ultimate irony.
They are the ones arguing about who gets the best seats in the kingdom, they are falling asleep in the garden, and they are running away at the first sign of trouble. Why would you build the foundation of a permanent structure out of such crumbling stones?
That is the defining paradox of the entire New Testament narrative. And the research offers a very specific, Christ-centered interpretation for this irony.
What's the interpretation?
The texts are actively arguing that the story of the disciples isn't actually about human potential. This isn't an ancient self-help manual on how to become a highly effective leader.
It's not 7 habits of highly effective disciples.
Exactly. The disciples, in all their bumbling, their density, and their failing, are literary and historical arrows pointing away from themselves and pointing directly to Jesus.
Unpack that a bit more. How do their failures point to him?
The research outlines 5 specific ways this dynamic works. First, they are called by him, which demonstrates his sovereign authority to choose whomever he wants, regardless of societal status.
Right, bypassing the elite.
Second, they are sent by him, demonstrating his absolute lordship over their lives and mission. Third, and directly to your point, they fail catastrophically and are restored by him, which permanently highlights his mercy and grace over human merit.
Which is the core message of Christianity anyway.
Exactly. Fourth, they function as the restored Israel gathering around him, showing that he is the true center and representative of God's people. And fifth, their eventual apostolic witness is the vehicle for the message reaching the nations.
So the failure is a feature, not a bug.
The extreme irony of their failure isn't an accident. It is the theological point. It permanently proves to the early church that the movement survived and conquered the empire because of the power of the message and the grace of the founder, not because the executive team was brilliant or flawless.
It completely shatters the illusion of the self-made holy man. It says the foundation of this faith isn't built on human perfection or pristine moral resumes. It is built entirely on divine mercy applied to broken people.
It levels the playing field completely.
Which brings us inevitably to the application, the so what. How does this ancient first-century startup team, with all their historical baggage, their sociological friction, and their theological symbolism, apply to modern life and leadership today?
The contemporary relevance is shockingly sharp, especially when you look at modern organizational culture. The research pulls out a profound practical theology from these texts. The absolute insistence that failure does not end usefulness, provided that repentance is genuine.
That is huge today. We live in a highly reactive culture that loves to discard people.
We love to cancel leaders the moment they show a flaw or make a mistake.
Absolutely. But the transformation of these men from fearful deniers cowering in a locked room to bold witnesses who, according to history and strong early tradition, largely face brutal martyrdom for their testimony, serves as a permanent, enduring template for leadership development.
It argues that the best leaders are often those who have been deeply broken and rebuilt.
And the research explicitly states that this model speaks directly to modern leadership crises. Honestly, looking around at the state of organizations today, both secular corporations and massive religious institutions, it is a glaring critique.
It is a very uncomfortable mirror to hold up.
The texts warn aggressively against charisma without obedience. Look at Judas. He is the ultimate cautionary tale. He had the ultimate proximity to the leader.
He was in the room where it happened.
He was trusted. He was literally managing the money for the group. He looked the part. He had the access. He probably sounded incredibly pious, but he completely lacked the internal conversion.
It is a terrifying warning about having the appearance of leadership and the right resume without any actual substance or loyalty to the core mission.
It is a devastating critique of superficial leadership. And furthermore, look at who was actually chosen to succeed.
Right. Look at the roster again.
By deliberately calling manual labor fishermen and a despised tax collector over the polished, wealthy, highly educated religious elites in Jerusalem, Jesus permanently challenged class prejudice.
He completely bypassed the expected Ivy League equivalents of his day. He ignored the men with the perfect theological pedigrees and the massive platforms.
It's like he was saying, we don't need the guys with the shiny resumes and the perfect PR training. Give me the guy who smells like bait and the guy everybody in town hates, and let's change the world with them.
It is the ultimate anti-celebrity leadership model.
Which raises a vital, highly challenging question for churches, corporations, and organizations today.
Yes, the apostolic pattern we've traced through this research argues for a very specific type of organizational culture. It argues for deep, Christ-centered character formation over rapid merit growth.
Depth over breadth.
It demands highly accountable leadership. It models humility under correction. Remember Peter, the leader of the group, having to accept public rebuke without flying into a defensive rage.
Could you imagine a modern CEO accepting a public rebuke like that?
Never. They'd hire a crisis PR firm immediately.
Right.
But the biblical model is the exact polar opposite of the celebrity-driven, platform-building, heavily curated, image-obsessed leadership models we see dominating so much of our culture today.
The ultimate takeaway from the historical texts is this. Truth is carried and sustained by faithful, authentic testimony, not by institutional image management.
Not by PR firms.
Not by spinning the narrative, not by burying the scandals, but by authentic, deeply flawed people pointing to something far greater than themselves.
That is the enduring legacy of the 12.
Well, we have covered massive ground today. We started by shattering the stained glass and stepping onto the dusty, politically fraught, Roman-occupied roads of first-century Galilee. We looked at the intense, scandalous sociological friction of taking a Roman collaborator and a zealot and forcing them to be brothers.
It was quite the journey.
We tracked their massive, embarrassing personal failures, the ultimate collapse of the startup in the Garden of Gethsemane, and followed them all the way through to their remarkable restoration as the foundational, symbolic witnesses of a movement that fundamentally reshaped human history.
They were the bridge.
But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Something that builds on everything we've just discussed, but pushes it a little further into how you and I operate today in our own spheres of influence.
This is the provocative part.
Think about this. The foundation of this massive, enduring global movement, a movement that outlasted the Roman Empire and shaped the course of the world, was deliberately built on men whose greatest qualification was their willingness to have their massive, embarrassing failures publicly recorded for all of history.
It's staggering when you frame it like that.
Their worst moments, their cowardice, their doubt, their petty arguments, their betrayals are written down in the best-selling, most widely translated book of all time for billions of people to read across millennia.
Total transparency.
If the prerequisite for foundational leadership in this movement was a permanent, highly public record of your worst moments, what does that say about our modern obsession with hiding our flaws?
Oh, that's a sharp question.
What does it say about our desperate, exhausting need to constantly curate our resumes, to filter our social media feeds, and to pretend we have it all together in order to gain a shred of authority or respect?
It makes our modern efforts look incredibly shallow.
Imagine if today's leaders, politicians, CEOs, influencers, pastors, or even just you and me in our own families, had to publicly publish our greatest, most humiliating failures before we were ever allowed to lead.
Nobody would want the job.
Imagine if the currency of authority wasn't perfection, but restored brokenness. It completely flips the script on what real power actually looks like.
It truly does.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the historical reality of the 12. Keep questioning the pristine narratives, keep peeling back those layers of stained glass, and most importantly, keep learning. Until next time.